um, who I am. That's
No,
it, we're
good.
recording now. Many of you will be wondering who I am. My name is Mark Battison. I'm a retired Anglican priest, currently living in Australia, and I'm a part of the leadership team for organising our webinars and conference. Stephen Sizer, who would normally do this, has got a family engagement, and Omar, who will be leading us in prayer shortly, is with us. So you are stuck with me today, and it's 5 o'clock in the morning. So if I make a mistake or I look like I'm falling asleep, it's because I am falling asleep. Today's webinar is on Zionism and anti-Semitism, and it is part of our overall conference program of religious extremism. Now, it's a Sabeel international operation. We're all involved in it, led by Sabeel Jerusalem, and you will all know Omar, I'm sure, who's our main leader in this. And our conference is in November. This is the second of a series of 5 webinars, and we're blessed that so many of you are here. I'm watching the numbers rise as we are sitting talking. Thankfully, in the background, we have young Lily, who's keeping people going from a bus in Jerusalem with a laptop on her knee. So bless you, Lily, for what you're doing. That's really impressive. So we have 3 speakers for you today: Hadar Cohen, Antony Lerman, and Thomas Suarez. And as each of them shares their part with us, I'll give you a very brief bio. Then I'll ask them to unmute themselves, and then from there we will continue through the program. So at the end, we hope to have 15 minutes for questions and answers. So again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. I'll make a record of them, and we'll ask the ones that are best suited, if we have time, for that particular speaker. So Omar, if you're with us, could you unmute yourself, and could you kindly lead us in an opening prayer? Okay, well, I can't hear Omar. I don't think any of you can. So I believe he's traveling in a car, so he may not be able to share the prayer. So I'll do it. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come to you as always at this time with heavy hearts, with fear, with uncertainty, and with a great deal of love for our brothers and sisters in Palestine, particularly in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and our diaspora. We pray, Lord, also for our Jewish brothers and sisters. We pray, Lord, for an end to the violence on all sides. But in particular, Lord, we pray for an end to the occupation, the genocidal actions of the government of Israel, which does not represent all its people. And for an end to the apartheid regime that is causing so much of the underlying problems of this situation. Lord, each of us here tonight has our own ministry in trying to advocate for your people. Many of us live in your troubled land, but we do so still, Lord, with a sense of your presence, with hope, and with a belief that if you are in the rubble and in the hearts and minds of all of your human beings, eventually all will be well. We pray, Lord, for all those who in that interim time are struggling and suffering so much. So, Lord, we offer you our webinar this evening. We pray for our speakers, and we pray that the work we do together will help in some way to educate and to bring an end to this terrible situation. Lord, we offer you our service and our work in praise of your name. Amen. So our first of our 3 speakers this evening is Antony Lerman. He's a senior fellow at the Bruno, and I apologize for my pronunciation if it's bad, at the Bruno Kreisky Forum for International Dialogue in Vienna. He's an honorary fellow at the Parkes Institute for the study of Jewish/non-Jewish relations at Southampton University, and author most recently of Whatever Happened to Anti-Semitism, Redefinition and the Myth of the Collective Jew. I'm sure that Antony, like all our speakers, is an awful lot more than that, but that's the little bio that I have. So Antony, please, over to you. If you could unmute yourself and share your thoughts with us.
Hello, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. So I hope everybody can hear me now. I do apologize for that silence.
Yes, we can.
Just by the way, anybody who wants to address me, everybody calls me Tony, so please do call me Tony. Anyway, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak here. And it's really a privilege and a pleasure to be with my two other speakers, Hadar Cohen and Thomas Suarez, such wonderful writers and artists and activists. It's a real honor, and thank you for asking me to open the discussion. So let me begin. I'm afraid that for me, war is the wider context for any discussion today of the relationship between anti-Semitism, Zionism, religious extremism, and apartheid. But I don't mean the so-called war between Israel and Hamas. I'll come to that in a second. Rather, I'm referring to the bitter war over what we understand anti-Semitism to mean today. A war of attrition stretching back 20 years, but turbocharged with the introduction into the public space of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism in 2016. A war inextricably linked to the consequences of the brutality and extreme ideological ruthlessness of modern Zionism. This war was intense enough before 7/10, but has taken on a more extreme character as powerful feelings about, on the one hand, the Hamas attacks and alleged Palestinian responsibility for what has been called a genocidal assault on Jews, and on the other hand, the Israeli genocidal response seen as extreme Zionism exploiting the crisis to ethnically cleanse Gaza, merge it with the Jewish state, and fill it with Jewish settlers. A key feature of the war over the meaning of anti-Semitism has been its weaponization. It's used for political purposes with no organic link to real anti-Semitism. Since 7/10, underpinned by IHRA, this has reached a new level of exploitation. We see this in two forms. The first is the characterization of the 7/10 Hamas attacks. Even as news of the atrocities was still emerging, they were described as a pogrom and as the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. These are quotes. The deployment of this anti-Semitism narrative had all the hallmarks of a coordinated propaganda offensive deployed by the Israeli government leaders and prominent far-right influential religious figures. And these descriptions continue to frame public discourse and understanding of the 7/10 events. Presented as an explosion of pure anti-Semitism, 7/10 is seen as an expression of the alleged anti-Semitic raison d'etre of Hamas. The second form deployment of weaponized anti-Semitism took was in relation to the tying of all Jews ever more closely to the political and ideological agenda of the far-right messianic religious forces ruling Israel today and justifying genocide, ethnic cleansing, and the ethno-nationalist, unending colonizing Zionist project to secure the entire biblical land of Israel exclusively for Jews. At every opportunity, Netanyahu and his ministers and their cheerleaders in the commentariat at home and abroad were claiming that Israel's violent response, the launch of an all-out war, was being undertaken on behalf of all Jews everywhere. In addition, a radicalized Messianic Jewish orthodoxy now embodies the supremacist expansionist Zionist ideology, which constitutes the only Zionism that has any agency today. As for the first form of weaponization, 7/10 as a pogrom, This Russian word, which I'm sure I don't need to remind anyone about really, referred to violent attacks by local non-Jewish populations on Jews in the Russian Empire and in other countries in the 19th century. They were perpetrated by the powerful oppressor against the weak and vulnerable. However grotesque, Hamas's attack was precisely the opposite. In the words of the Palestinian scholar Tariq Bakoni, writing for the website of Al-Shabaka, the international Palestinian think tank of which he is the president, the attacks were, quote, an unprecedented display of anti-colonial violence, end quote. An attack on what was always a vulnerable target that symbolized the powerful Israeli state driving subjugation of Gaza's population. And with regard to the Holocaust comparison, such apocalyptic language distorts and trivializes the Nazi genocide of Jews. In August 2002, while being interviewed by the US TV channel Democracy Now!, the late outspoken, respected head of Israel's then most left-wing party, Meretz, in the 1990s, Shulamit Aloni, candidly condemned it, quote, as a trick. We always use it. When from Europe somebody is criticizing Israel, then we bring up the Holocaust, end quote. Nothing has changed. Actually, that's incorrect. Weaponizing the Holocaust has gotten much worse. As for the second form of weaponization, those of you who are familiar with the text of the IHRA working definition will know that one of the 11 examples of anti-Semitism is holding Jews, quote, holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the state of Israel, end quote. This may sound morally correct and reasonable, but the injunction to avoid doing this is fundamentally undermined in two ways. First, as I've already indicated, Israeli leaders co-opt and instrumentalize Jews worldwide by labeling every military confrontation, every battle with Hamas or Hezbollah as being on behalf of the, quote, Jewish people, making Jews complicit whether they wish to be or not. But even more compromising is the blatant, unequivocal position taken by the leading mainstream Orthodox Jewish figure in the UK, the British United Synagogue Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mervis, who praised the Israeli soldiers committing genocide in Gaza in the name of eradicating anti-Semitism as, and I quote, our heroic soldiers, end quote. This was widely supported by Jews here. Could it be any more obvious what weaponized anti-Semitism leads to? It does nothing to make Jews safer from anti-Semitism. The Gaza crisis has even more definitively set the seal on the conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. The redefinition of anti-Semitism I trace and analyze in my book that Mark mentioned earlier. And while its deleterious consequences for Jews are highly significant, its implications for the Palestinians are dire. In public discourse today, Palestinian and Hamas terrorist are synonymous. Therefore, to suggest Palestinians might be deserving of rights, sovereignty, and solidarity, for example, as is plainly implied in the slogan, quote, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is itself regarded by the Israeli government and its supporters worldwide as an expression of support for violence against Jews. The Israeli journalist and academic Natasha Roth-Roland writes, and I quote, preventing this and fighting it when it happens essentially posits Israeli state violence, ethnic cleansing, mass incarceration, extrajudicial killing, land theft, as a form of protected behavior because, she says, it is being carried out by Jews, end quote. The continued success of weaponization relies on a distorted and instrumentalized view of Jewish history, the notion that on the one hand, anti-Semitism is eternal and unchanging, and yet on the other, anti-Zionism is the, quote, new anti-Semitism. Either way, the politicized anti-Semitism organizations, for example, the Anti-Defamation League in the USA, the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism in the UK, and many other such organizations worldwide, constantly encourage people to believe that anti-Semitic annihilation is just around the corner. The first eternalist understanding of the Jewish past, described as the lachrymose view, ignores anti-Semitism's contingent and historically specific forms. As for anti-Zionism, nothing could be more Jewish. Jews were the first anti-Zionists, overwhelmingly remained so until the Second World War, and hundreds of thousands remain and numerously newly identify as anti-Zionist now. It's not only the history of anti-Semitism or the way different societies, civilizations, religions have related to Jews that does not stand still. Zionism itself has proved to be multifaceted and subject to reconfiguration. What is central to Zionism today was always present in Zionist ideology, albeit to a great degree latent. Its early secular character has been replaced by a religious one, which has made it ever more uncompromising. God's will is being done. It's not the logic of history or of Enlightenment principles of national self-determination that's so important anymore. Hastening the coming of Moshiach is what drives Zionism today, and it is the Palestinians who stand in the way of it being realized, both physically by, quote-unquote, occupying the land of Israel, and symbolically by the existence of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which stands on the site of the ruins of the Second Temple, the rebuilding of which is a central aim of Messianic Zionism. While one of the fundamental tenets of Zionism has always been that anti-Semitism will be defeated once Jews have their own state, quite clearly the sine qua non of Zionism has been abandoned. Anti-Semitism has become a weapon of state policy. IHRA, promoted by the state as well as by Zionist and pro-Israel groups around the world, has become a shield protecting Israel from any form of criticism, but particularly the criticism inherent in what Palestinians have to say about their past and present dispossession and subjugation, were free speech to be unequivocally respected. Moreover, the elision of Judaism and Zionism has given the Israeli state and Zionists of most stripes, including non-Jewish ones like the millions of evangelical Christians in the USA, both incentive and license to demonize Jews who oppose Zionism, not only as self-hating or aiding and abetting the enemies of the Jewish people, but also as unrelentingly anti-Semitic. And don't for one moment think that this is entirely new, that the relationship between anti-Semitism and Zionism has always been purely an adversarial one, that they're polar opposites. In reality, the relationship between the two is more complicated. Implacably opposed to anti-Semitism, Herzl and the Zionist movement as a whole may well have been. Many nonetheless recognized that anti-Semitism was a crucial recruiting sergeant for Zionism. Herzl himself concluded in his diaries that, quote, the anti-Semites will become our most loyal friends. The anti-Semitic nations will become our allies, end quote. He himself used anti-Semitic tropes when criticizing Jews, especially Ostjuden, who opposed Zionism. The diasporic Jew became Zionism's first other, the Israeli historian Idit Zertel writes. The affinity between Herzl and Arthur Lord Balfour, author of the Balfour Declaration, seen as the founding document of the Jewish state, was not so much love of Jews as the philosopher and academic anti-Semitism expert and colleague Brian Klug writes, quote, many anti-Semites supported Zionism, most famously Balfour, and it was a Jewish member of the conservative government's cabinet at the time, Edwin Montagu, who vehemently opposed issuing the Balfour Letter on the grounds that it was liable to increase anti-Semitism because it would strengthen the view of Jews as aliens belonging elsewhere. Balfour himself, Klug continues, was of this view. He believed the Zionist movement would, quote, mitigate the age-long miseries created for Western civilization by the presence in its midst of a body which it too long regarded as alien and even hostile, but which it was equally unable to expel or to absorb, end quote. It's therefore not far-fetched to see Zionism not just as a form of racism, but also as a form of anti-Semitism. The evidence is quite stark, even if we set aside the evangelical zeal for all Jews to, quote-unquote, return to Israel so that they can be immolated in the Armageddon that will herald the return of Christ. The enthusiasm for Israel and its extreme ethno-nationalist Zionism on the part of far-right forces in many parts of the world does not extend to supporting Jews as such. It frees such forces to deploy traditional anti-Semitic tropes in their political campaigns and to condemn Jews who are critical of Israel and support Palestinian liberation, the default positions of the far-right Messianic Israeli regime. This tangled history, and with this I close, this tangled history and poisonous present must be interrogated and understood. Without that understanding, how can we expose the truth about Zionism today and about the manipulation and political exploitation of definitional discourse on anti-Semitism to justify anti-Palestinian racism? These are essential tasks if we are to challenge apartheid and religious extremism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. I'm just going to pause for a second while we try to absorb a lot of what Tony has just shared with us. So I'll just pause, and then if I've gone quiet, you'll understand why. Be back shortly. Okay, thanks again, Tony. I really do appreciate that. You've generated quite a lot of comments within the chat box, and I appreciate everybody for having shared their thoughts so far. Please do keep doing so. But please let's also remember that this very emotive, passionate subject can give rise to very emotive, passionate wording. So let's be careful as we write in the chat box that we're respectful of each other in everything we write, while still being challenging and direct. So we're blessed now with Hadar Cohen, is going to share her thoughts on the same subject. Hadar is an Arab Jewish scholar. She's a mystic, an artist, and founder of, and I apologize, Hadar, Malshut, a spiritual skill building school teaching Jewish mysticism and direct experience of God. She's a 10th generation Jerusalemite with lineage roots also in Syria, Kurdistan, Iraq, and Iran. It sounds like a very interesting background. So Hadar, if you'd like to unmute yourself and then share your thoughts with us. Bless you.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mark. And thank you for opening us with that really beautiful prayer. Yeah, it definitely moved my heart. And thank you so much, Antony or Tony, for sharing your remarks as well. Yeah, really honored to be in this panel. Thank you, Omar and Sabeel, for inviting me. Yeah, I want to share a few things, and I wanted to just start off by naming just how intensely painful it is, this moment, on so many levels, but particularly for me as a Jewish person, as an Arab Jewish person, who, you know, it's not just about witnessing this ongoing genocide, but it's also about this witnessing of the ways that the notions of my safety are used against Palestinians, against Arabs, against Muslims, and creates a lot of harm and suffering and oppression for those communities. And sometimes it feels like I want to, let me just, the languaging. Okay, I don't know, some language remarks came up on me, but hopefully it's okay. Yeah, sometimes I feel that it's just really painful because it feels like the narrative around Jewishness and about anti-Semitism is happening without my consent as a Jewish person, and then this public narrative is shaped and formed through it. So I want to just share a little bit of how I see the context of this conversation about anti-Semitism and how we arrived in this moment, and just some of my thinking around it. So first of all, I think it's really important when we're talking about anti-Semitism to acknowledge its roots, which really were right through the Roman Empire, and through the rise of the Christian European Roman Empire, that really deemed Jews as right, these demonic forces that were opposed to the Antichrist. And you know, I think there's also a way that you can think of Jews, especially around that time, you know, as the conception of them being Oriental, meaning they were barbaric because they did not adopt the new Christian religion. They stayed right in these biblical times, biblical traditions, and they did not right convert or assimilate in perhaps ways that the Roman Empire desired them to. So this is, you know, part of the origination of the system of anti-Semitism, which was very much linked to the empire, right, to the conquest and to the imperialistic nature of the Roman Empire. And I think it's also important to recognize that systems of oppression evolve and change throughout time, right? So it's been thousands of years, right, of the ways in which anti-Semitism has morphed and shifted and changed. And when we're arriving in this modern political context, it's really important to understand that Zionism, right, as a modern settler colonial political ideology, really only succeeded because it was in collaboration with European colonial imperialistic empires, right? There was an interest in Zionism, not for Jewish safety, but actually to further colonialism. And it was tied to a certain global imperialistic lens. And I think that's really important to make that distinction, because oftentimes the narrative around Zionism is that it's very much connected to Jewish safety. And it obscures the ways in which colonialism is just so embedded in the history of Zionism. And I also, you know, Tony touched on this as well, but I think it's important to understand that when Zionism as a political ideology first formed, it actually did not get a lot of Jewish support, you know, across Europe and also across the Middle East, actually. And the reason why Zionism got support was because really after the Holocaust, there was this massive problem of what do we do with the Jewish community? Where do the Jews go? What is the notion of Jewish safety? So Zionism was a very, very bad answer to a very real problem of anti-Semitism. Now, I also want to really highlight that this framing is also really coming from a Eurocentric lens that is really understanding Jews as Jews in Europe and their experience in Europe. And meanwhile, you know, there's been communities all over the Middle East, of which I come from, right, Arab Jewish communities, that had very, very different histories than the Jewish communities in Europe. Communities in Baghdad, communities in Morocco and Egypt and Yemen, right, in all these places. And the way that anti-Semitism functioned there was completely different than how it functioned in Europe. And, you know, there's so much to get into that. And I think that it's important to really understand that while Jewish experience in Europe was largely through this way of not belonging, of being othered, of not integrating, of right living in the ghetto, living in the shtetl, constantly kind of resisting this Christianization in Europe. In the Middle East, we see a very different history, a history that has been very obscured and very deliberately, right, misinforming people of what actually was in the history. And sometimes I will tell you that as an Arab Jewish scholar, it feels sometimes even impossible to carve out the roots of what actually happened in my own lands, because the ways that the history books have been obstructed to twist my own history is quite extreme. But you know, we do see lineages of, you know, coexistence, and coexistence is a word that has so much layers to it. But we do see a way in which Jewish people were actually integrated into Arab communities and societies. When you're listening to Arabic music, you see Jewish people as being prominent leaders in that. Jewish people were just so integral. So they weren't othered in the way that they were in Europe. They actually, there was a very deep level of belonging. Jewish communities were living in places like Baghdad for thousands of years. So I think that's really important to name, because part of what we're also witnessing is the rupture of not just, right, those lineages and those communities, but also of the memory of that world, that actually Jewish belonging is not only something that is possible, but is actually something that has happened. Now, that's not to deny the levels of, oppression that existed around Jewish communities in those regions. Of course, anti-Semitism is a global issue, but, through Avi Shleim's work and other scholars, we can see that anti-Semitism in the Middle East was not institutionalized in the way that it was in Europe, but rather when there were attacks on the Jewish communities, it wasn't necessarily just because they were Jews and they fit into this institutionalized systemic oppression, but it was because they were minorities. And this is something that actually so many minority groups suffered throughout the region as well. So the context of attacks against Jewish communities was just completely different. I think it's important to name that context, because I think what we are seeing now is the ways in which systems of oppression mold and shift actors and roles. So I feel that a lot of the European anti-Semitic lineage has been completely transferred onto Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims in those communities. And I think that you can see it really, really sharply, even by the own Israeli media and the way that it portrays certain things. I think that the parallels between Nazi Germany and Israeli apartheid are pretty stark, right? We can see them visibly, that the images coming out of Gaza and the images of the Holocaust and the stories, right? There's a lot of similarities there. But the way that the narrative has shifted, right, is that in the Israeli media, there was, politicians that they were saying, either we go and bomb Gaza or we go back to Auschwitz. So all of a sudden, there's these only two options, right? Like this ongoing massacre that's leading into a genocide in Gaza, or this like a Holocaust narrative, and the way that the choices have been so limited to that. But I think that just speaks to the ways in which, the image of who the Nazis were is now completely projected onto Palestinians. So in the Israeli media and in the Israeli psyche, when they're relating to Palestinians in Gaza, they are thinking of them as the Nazis. And that has been a deliberate narrative projection that is actually imperative to what allows Israel to do what it's doing and to continue on its war crimes. And I think that it's really, really important to dismantle this narrative, right? Because I think it also lets off European countries off the hook, right? That it's now, this was kind of in some ways a desire, if we think about the final solution and the Nazi regime, right? It was very convenient. Okay, we'll give the Jews Palestine, so then there could be conflict there, and then that will be, the end of the Jews. So there is anti-Semitic origins in the ways that Zionism was created even, and in the ways that it's practiced now, as Tony has shared as well. And I think that, we continue to see that, in European countries like Germany, like France, like the UK, the ways that they use and weaponize anti-Semitism because they are actually scared of confronting their own roots of anti-Semitism and just completely projecting that onto Muslims and Arabs and Palestinians and further demonizing them. So this is something that, I think is really, it's quite painful. And I think recently, maybe some folks have seen this, there were two artists, one Israeli and one Palestinian, Yuval Abraham and Bassel Adra, who just produced a film called No Other Land, which is about the community of Massafariyata and the ongoing systemic violence that they face in terms of dispossession and settler violence. And they won an award in Berlin for this film. Now, Yuval was deemed anti-Semitic for saying for calling for a ceasefire and for calling Israel an apartheid regime. And he actually wrote these beautiful remarks of how ironic it is that Germany, non-Jewish Germans, right, are criticizing Yuval, who has, Holocaust lineage, around what is or isn't anti-Semitic. And I think that is really important to share, because sometimes this narrative is not actually just perpetuated by Jews themselves, right? Sometimes Jewish people, like I feel like I'm being used as a pawn without my consent. And I really believe that we need to, instead of falling for that narrative, which is a colonial narrative of divide and conquer, we need to intervene in that narrative. And we have to stand in solidarity, Jews and Palestinians, against apartheid together. Because I think the situation is just so extreme. And I think I'll also just say lastly, 2 more points, is that one of my frustrations with the narrative about anti-Semitism and its relationship to Zionism is that it sometimes seems like the way that the Zionist agenda talks about anti-Semitism, it talks about it as something that is unsolvable, as something that is just will always be here, that Jews are fundamentally unsafe in the world, and there's just like actually no cure for it. And I think that there's something really awful about that. That's actually deeply anti-Semitic, right? To say that there's actually no answer for Jewish oppression, and that the only answer has to be, right, ongoing militarization and ongoing oppression. There's something that just is logically inconsistent there with a politics of justice, and the ways in which, right, the question of Jewish safety has been replaced with unconditional support for Israel, which is a nation state that is an apartheid regime. And now anyone who criticizes the apartheid regime, right, it's seen as a critique around Jewish safety. So this equation is something that we really need to dismantle, and we have to do that collectively. I believe that the only way forward is a multi-religious, multiracial solidarity group that really understands the way that these dynamics are set up and rejects them. And actually, right, comes from our faith traditions, which is the call to justice, the call of justice for all people. And right now, this is 144 days since the beginning of the start of genocide in Gaza. So we're in very extreme times with a lot of very brutal violence, and the narrative that is upholding that is first filled with logical inconsistencies, but is just, pervasive with global governmental powers. And I think that the more we kind of understand what is happening here, the more that we can be educated about the way that this system works, the more that we can also learn how to come together to dismantle it. So I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to staying more for questions and such. Thank you so much for having me. I hope that this analysis was something that is useful and helpful. Yeah, and I'll pass it back to Mark.
Bless you, Hadar. Thank you so much. Again, a little bit like Tony, there's an awful lot to absorb within what you said. So, and the chat box has gone crazy as well. So we have lots of questions for afterwards. But let's just, again, I'll pause just for a few seconds. Just let us think about what you said. Okay, thank you. Our third speaker, and I'm going to shorten it from Thomas to Tom, because that's what it says on his little picture. I hope that's okay, Tom. Tom Suarez is a London-based historical researcher, as well as a professional Juilliard-trained violinist and composer. Well, a former West Bank resident. His latest book is Palestine Hijacked: How Zionism Forged an Apartheid State from River to Sea, which has been praised by Noam Chomsky as a damning story, heavily documented, far too revealing to be tolerated. Very interesting comment. So, Tom, over to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you. My great thanks for organizing this panel, and I'm very honored to be speaking along with Tony and Hadar. I will be speaking much along the same lines, but hopefully from a slightly different angle that will complement what they've said. The ongoing genocide, the removal and the erasure of the land's native people was always Zionism's endgame, not the result of evolving events. And it has always been claimed to have been carried out in the name of Jews and through the exploitation of anti-Semitism. Indeed, Israel, the Israeli state, as I look at it, is woven out of the weaponization of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has, of course, always been the alleged rationale for Zionism and the Israeli state. The deliberate transference of historic Western anti-Semitism and even Nazi identity onto the Palestinians is core to the dehumanization of the Palestinians, a dehumanization so complete that the Western public watches their genocide play out in real time on their phones as though it were some video game. Zionism wields the fear of anti-Semitism to keep those under its spell obedient. And I would argue that Zionism has created a cult out of anti-Semitism, in which anti-Semitism, real or invented, is what gives its devotees meaning. And in my view, this psychosis, this drug of anti-Semitism to which Zionism has gotten its devotees addicted, is why we have a phenomena of Zionist Jews faking anti-Semitic incidents, such as swastikas scrawled on the wall or their dormitory door, this sort of thing. Even, in some cases, even bomb scares, a phenomena that I believe is more widespread than has been acknowledged. The cry of anti-Semitism, real or fake, is the key money-raising tool for the Zionists. Zionism has always exploited hatred of Jews as a positive marketing strategy to get actual anti-Semites on board. If you don't want Jews showing up on your shores, support Zionism because we have a huge ghetto for them far away from you. And most importantly, the smear, the false accusation of anti-Semitism to silence opposition to its crimes, is Israel's most powerful military weapon because it is the weapon upon which all the others depend. Take that away. Deny Israel its claim to be the Jews. Deny Israel this anti-Semitic hijacking of Jewish identity and all its weapons of explosives, all its messianic narrative, all its political extortion, and all its marketing would be impotent. The smear works by making the Israeli state and Jews, as Jews, one and the same, thus making Jews the doers of Israel's crimes, so that to blame the state is to blame Jews. But for the very reason that it holds Jewish identity hostage as a human shield to insulate its crimes, it is, in my view, the ultimate manifestation of anti-Semitism. Yet we have been afraid to expose this for what it is, because doing so, we will be branded as, yes, anti-Semitic. Traditional anti-Semitism, for all its horrors, is powerless to harm the integrity of Jews or Judaism. In other words, it's powerless to make its libels true. The Israeli state and Zionism, if we accept them at their word, succeed. If we accept their claims on Jewish identity, then we are the common racist blaming Jews as Jews. Freeing Palestine means defanging this most powerful weapon that helps keep the Palestinians in shackles. And this weapon is far more powerful than is visible. We see it when someone is silenced with a smear. But for every time that happens, there were 10,000 where people simply didn't speak up so as not to be shot with this allegorical bullet. Now, I'd like to propose one idea that I feel is correct, but that I realize might be considered contentious and for which I especially welcome feedback and criticism. My view is that the word anti-Semitism, the word itself, is problem one. We must stop using it and replace it with something generic, as is applied to anybody. For example, anti-Jewish bigotry, something of that sort. Why? Well, in my view, the term anti-Semitism, it's of course nonsensical in its use of the term Semitic, but that's relatively minor. Importantly, the use of a dedicated term for bigotry against Jews, as opposed to bigotry against any other group, feeds into the notion of Jewish exceptionalism and thus Israeli exceptionalism. Already in the UN in November 1947, in the lead up to Resolution 181, Ben-Gurion argued that his Jewish state cannot be judged by the norms of other nations. For Israel, the beauty of the word anti-Semitism is that it is a blunt weapon that obscures what act is actually being alleged, thus allowing it to be interpreted. It is only because of this extra blurry layer separating us from the concept that enables people to argue about what it means. It is because of this word that we have most infamously the IHRA pseudo definition that is official US State Department policy and has been adopted formally or de facto by many institutions and governments, and far less egregious but still Zionist interpretations such as the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. For no other group is there such intrigue and mystery and controversy surrounding the simple issue of what bigotry against that group means. And for no other group is there a special dedicated term for bigotry against that group. The use of any generic term would leave Israel's propagandists vastly less wiggle room to tell us what bigotry against Jews means. In its early years, Zionism was openly and correctly understood as just a new version of anti-Semitism. It was the forfeiture of the struggle for equality and the surrender to the lies of the anti-Semites. Indeed, political Zionism's founder, Theodor Herzl, loathed traditional Jews, and his diatribes against them could easily be mistaken for Nazi propaganda. And so anti-Semitic should have been the epithet that buried Zionism along with Herzl. But Herzl and those who followed fought back by placing Zionism above Judaism. They claimed worldwide Jewish allegiance and crowned Zionism as the standard by which good Jews and bad Jews are distinguished, hijacking Jewish identity for their racial nationalist movement. The result is today's nation state that calls itself the Jewish state. This term is also, in my view, integral to the militarization of anti-Semitism. We accept this trilogy of words, the Jewish state, with little thought. But even on the obvious level, the term the Jewish state already creates a magic shield around Israel. Its exterior demands unqualified respect, yet wields the threat of its invisible bullet hidden within. It shoots its bullets without leaving any forensic evidence, as if it were a talisman that wards off enemies without leaving any trace. If you disregard the talisman, then you're met with, why are you always criticizing the Jewish state? Or you have this bug about the Jewish state, or any variation of this. Smears without the overt accusation, thus leaving the victim not even the option of responding to the smear unless he or she overtly raises the issue of anti-Semitism in response, which only has the appearance of vindicating the smear. Thus, the term the Jewish state, in my view, is a brilliant military weapon. There is an entire world of narrative hidden within these three words, the most powerful of which is the article, the. Israel does not claim to be merely a Jewish state in the sense of countries that have a national religion. Indeed, to quote Ben-Gurion, Israel has nothing to do with Judaism, but rather with his words, being a Jew. Israel is the only Jewish state, as its apologists constantly remind us, not in the sense that there happen to be no others, but because by Israel's construct there can be no other. There is no analogy to this with any other nation state worldwide. Its claim over Jews is global and involves ethnicity itself, not citizenship. This nation-state adaptation of tribalism is the internal workings of its weapon of silencing critics through the smear of anti-Semitism. Now, where else do we come across this same mentality? It is the method of common bigots. Racists blame individuals by virtue of claimed oneness with some ethnicity or nationality or type. And so, obvious example, during the spread of COVID-19, Chinese-looking people were attacked because the virus came from China. They, the Chinese, caused COVID. This is classic ignorant bigotry, and we all condemn it. But Israel's magic shield works by doing precisely this to Jews, but turning it around in order to hold Jewish identity ransom to insulate its crimes. And instead of condemning this anti-Semitism, we run in fear from it, which is doubly tragic because we are also running in fear from what, in my view, is Zionism's fatal flaw, the exposing of which can do so much to liberate Palestine. Simply put, Israel is conducting genocide and blaming it on the Jews. And so we must turn the tables and set matters straight, accuse Israel and its defenders of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism has become a Zionist racket. For many years, organizations such as the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, the Community Security Trust, and the Board of Deputies, or in the United States, the Anti-Defamation League, have been devoted to maintaining an ever-increasing hysteria over anti-Semitism, both to keep Zionism's adherents terrified and to keep us silent. Does anyone remember any of these organizations announcing, "Great news, anti-Semitism has declined this quarter or even leveled off"? No, it is so farcical that several years ago, the Daily Mail reported the headline, "Jews feel as threatened as they did in the Holocaust, experts say," and there has been no let-up since. Yet the media continued to parrot one new alarm after the other without betraying the slightest curiosity. Now, the purpose for these politically engineered statistics is obvious. They are to keep us too frightened to speak up. Now, yes, we should challenge the criteria used and the method used to compile these statistics, but to focus on that is simply to play into their terms of debate, endorsing the underlying unspoken lie that anti-Semitism has something to do with Palestine or with Palestinian human rights. No, we condemn anti-Semitism as we condemn all bigotry, not because this particular kind of bigotry has anything special to do with us. That is the real point. A Zionist invention calculated to grease the wheels of genocide, and we must say so. One need look no further than the all but universal Western reaction to the events of October 7th, as Tony has pointed out. It is not even questioned that the breaching of the concentration camp wall was an attack rooted in hatred of Jews, that this was a pogrom. We are this deep into the lies of a narrative on which we as a society have been brainwashed in order to keep us desensitized as genocide is carried out in our name. So, what to do if you are falsely smeared with the anti-Semitism label? In my opinion, the absolute rule is never respond on the terms handed to you. Don't respond with protestations of your innocence, nor with any form of pseudo-apology for anything you didn't do, thinking you will placate the inquisitors. When the scarlet letter A for anti-Semitism is scrawled on your chest, you should instead correctly boomerang the charge back, and it must include the words that the smear was intended to silence. They're thrilled if you protest because anti-Semitism remains the issue, you remain on the defensive, and because the words Palestine and apartheid and genocide are nowhere to be found. Just to close up, Israel's unbridled savagery has elicited such worldwide revulsion that it has handed us an unprecedented opportunity to fight back. The butchery has created cracks in Israel's armor, its grand messianic narrative that normally keeps us, the Western public, compliant. This opportunity has come at a ghastly cost, and we must not squander it. We must stop fighting on their terms and take control of the discourse. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom. I'm a little bit overawed by our three speakers, to be perfectly honest, but let's just pause a second to try to absorb some of what Tom said there. We are an hour into essentially an hour's webinar, but I feel that we can't just finish at this point. I've got 5 pages of copy and pasted questions from the chat box already for both Tony, Hadar, and Tom, and it's impossible to go through them all. But I think it might be helpful for us all for 2 things. Firstly, if you have got a comment, keep going in the chat box, but also read other people's, please, because it'll, I'm sure, help you to focus in your thoughts. But secondly, perhaps if we have 10 or 15 minutes left, I could ask each of you in the same order, Tony, then Hadar, then Tom, if you could give us a couple of minutes of, your thoughts on what happens the day after. Where do we go with, clearly, when some ideal situations are dead in the water and have been for a while, is many people's view about two-state. How do we, and I know that you've all got individual contacts within the Jewish and Palestinian communities that will give you views of what's happening, and we certainly do in Sabeel. But what happens the day after the war? And I appreciate that this is not the only war. It's been going on since 47, but the current Gaza situation ends. Tony, do you have a few minutes thought on that? And then Hadar, and then Tom. Tony, you're still, I know you're trying to find the right button, you're muted.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes, I can, sir.
Yeah. I mean, this is the subject that you can't avoid, but on the other hand, it's very difficult even to speculate about to some degree, because I mean, what does it mean the day after? I mean, there are various day afters. You can get some weird optimist that is going to say, well, this is a wonderful opportunity, and the day after is the basis of a new peace, etc. And all will be lovely, and Gaza will be reconstructed, and so on and so forth. And then there's a day after, which is literally ethnic cleansing, genocide, literally clearing the Gazans, the Palestinians, out of the territory, and the fulfillment of Zionism, of what Zionism is today, which is to bring Gaza into what the ultra Orthodox and the ultra Zionists say is part of Eretz Yisrael Hashlema. It's part of the land of Israel, and therefore, it should be settled. That we've heard, there's a lot of discourse about that. So it's very difficult to know. But when you say the day after, if we look around what's being said in the media and the commentators and the politicians and the debates in parliaments, etc., what's understood when people talk about the day after is, well, what kind of peace is there going to be, and what kind of state or what kind of political arrangements will Israel come to with others which will set things back on the track of leading to a two-state solution. And I have to say, I think this is just bizarre and totally unrealistic, and is of no help to the Palestinians. And this is something I've been discussing the last few days, actually, with some Palestinians, and of course, you know, they feel that this is, or I'm sure not all, but many feel that this is just distraction. It's just a way of sort of parking a much more fundamental problem, occupation and apartheid, etc., etc. There's no reality in this talk about a two-state solution. There is no possibility, in my view, of there being a two-state solution. You know, just think about the West Bank as being part of a Palestinian state. With 500,000 settlers, excluding Jerusalem, there, what do you do with them? I've heard all, you know, all kinds of things of like, well, you know, pay them to come back into sort of in 1967 borders. I think this is nonsense. I think there's more likely to be a bloodbath, frankly. So I can't offer anything really in terms of, I'm afraid, what the day after. I think there has to be a relentless focus on Palestinian rights and the Palestinian future and justice and so on. This is what, again, some of the Palestinians I was speaking to say. They won't get drawn into this narrative about day after and two states. They feel that they've still got a lot of work to do and focus on, you know, getting people to understand what it means to for Palestinians to have their rights, how just it is, how these fundamental principles are the things that ultimately are going to be the basis of any real just solution to the situation. So I personally, you know, am very pessimistic about the day after, and I know people will have to discuss it and talk about it, but I don't see any pretty solutions, and certainly the two-state solution is not the answer.
Thank you, Tony. The reason that I kind of dropped this terrible question onto the three of you without any warning is that certainly in Australia, and I know in the UK, where my two main contact bases, and I know it's to a certain degree in the press in America as well, this wording of the day after is what a lot of ordinary people who have no concept of really what's happening in Palestine are focusing on. They're being directed that way, and it may be that they're being directed way through this very powerful Jewish marketing strategy in terms of seeing it through their eyes, but it will help, I'm sure, a lot of us to try to get an understanding of people, you know, you three's views, because you're very much focused on the Zionism and anti-Semitism area. So what you've just said is very helpful. It is a common feeling that we're being asked to look at, and it may be a deflection. Well, it is a deflection, but at the same time, as an advocate, I want to try to say, well, if two-state is dead, what do you think is what I'm being asked, and I try to come up with an answer. So that helps me, Tony, very much. Hadar, would you like to make a comment on that? If you and Tom don't want to, that's not a problem.
Sure, I'm happy to. Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, I have a few thoughts. One, I mean, first, I agree with Tony around the two-state solution being dead and not really possible in any way. So I think when people kind of bring that narrative forward, it seems like they're a bit politically stuck in the 90s. But to me, I think this conversation that we're having now is absolutely critical in that, because, you know, so many people have fallen into this narrative that Israel protects the Jews, right? So part of really untangling that is recognizing that, yes, we do have to have a conversation about anti-Semitism. And actually, Tom, I liked what you said, and I'm totally here for a name change around maybe calling it oppression against or whatever it is, but there does need to be a reckoning, right, around Jewish safety, Jewish belonging. It just can't happen through Zionism. And I think it also has to happen through an acknowledgement of the ways in which Jews were set up under Zionism is anti-Semitic. So the more that we build that analysis and the more that we can understand that the unity between Palestinians and Jewish people against Israeli apartheid, that's actually a mutual cause. You know, the communities are impacted in different ways, of course. But I think that changing the narrative is imperative to ending the genocide, ending the occupation, ending the violence, all of that. And to me, the only like narrative that really can do that is aligning Jews and Palestinians together against apartheid. Now, in terms of what that means for the day after, I mean, I don't really know. I don't really know what day after, right? Is it the day after a ceasefire? Is it the day after, right? Because I mean, yes, what's happening in Gaza is absolutely horrific and, you know, kind of one of the most massive scale since we've seen, but there's still ongoing violence that's happening all over the West Bank. That's, you know, rarely acknowledged in the Western narrative. So the day after, you know, I just feel like there needs to be a reckoning with the ongoing continuation. And, you know, what it is about this moment is that, you know, especially with Israeli, Saudi normalizations that we're about to, you know, perhaps go through, part of October 7th was putting a wrench in that and to say, like, it's actually not possible for Israel to continue on as it is without reckoning with Palestine and with Palestinians and with the oppression that Palestinians have gone in the Nakba and are going till this very day. So to me, like this notion of the day after, it's like almost like every day is the day after, right? Because it's a continuous thing. And I think that the more that we understand that Jewish safety is actually bound up in Palestinian liberation, right? Because so many Jewish communities have been sold this narrative that if Palestinians are free, that means, right, that Jews will be murdered or Jews will be, you know, all killed or, you know, that kind of narrative. And we really have to bring the narrative forward that actually Palestinian and Jewish safety are together. I mean, we see this, right? The more that Israel oppresses Palestinians, the more it actually makes Jewish people unsafe, both within Israel and actually globally, right? Because Israel is seen as a Jewish state, and then people are upset by the actions of the Israeli state. And because Israel does such a good job at correlating between Judaism and Zionism, then people, you know, get confused, and when they attack Zionism, they attack Jewish people, and you know, sometimes that's synagogues in places all over the world, and the communities, the Jewish communities all over the world who suffer the most are the Jewish communities who are minorities and smaller communities, like what happened in Tunisia or in Armenia and all these other places. So we really have to understand how Jewish communities are actually suffering all over the world also. And yeah, I think that to me, the only model is Jews and Palestinians together against Israeli apartheid and really kind of squashing that narrative that Israel represents the Jewish people and Israel speaks for the Jewish people and that Israel's actions is for the protection of the Jewish people and to, you know, reroute the narrative towards Jewish solidarity with Palestinians, as, you know, because I believe that that's what is called for, is like the just and true thing to do in this moment, but also because I believe that our liberation is bound up in that as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I want to make some other comments, but I'll just pause. Tom, we're reaching an opportunity for you to share your thoughts on this.
Thank you. I agree with everything that has been said. Just to add to continue this idea about the day after, I think it has to be stressed to the public the nonsensical nature of this concept. According to the impression the public has, is that when there's nothing happening, when neither so-called side is doing something to the other so-called side, they interpret this as peace. No, it has been static violence all along, even when there is nothing that is newsworthy. And this has to be stressed, that it's not that it's going to be over. No, it has been going on 24/7, not just since late 1947, but really for a century. And once the immediate genocide, however this plays out to where it's less newsworthy, we go back to the static violence of pre-October 7th. I think what we have to do is to get over this great taboo of challenging the existence of the state itself. Now, as I see it, the crimes of the Israeli state, they're not errors of the state. They're what the state was created to do. And I think that we need to start to challenge Israel's right to exist. And arguing for a single state, river to sea, everybody equal, including the latest settlers and the latest outpost, everybody stay there, but everybody's equal under the law. This would mean that the Israeli state no longer exists. But we're not allowed to say that. And I think we have to fight back against this and start to breach the issue and fight against the misrepresentations of this that will immediately come. South Africa is a different state than it was 50 years ago. It's not a different people. Nobody got hurt when apartheid South Africa became a nation of all its people. The idea of two states has to be categorically dismissed as insane. There's all the problems, even what we refer to as the occupation. Now, ending the occupation insinuates two states. So what happens if we end the occupation? Well, there'll still be apartheid for non-Jews within Israel. The refugees, or the primary victims of this apartheid, still won't be able to go home to the land under Israeli control. The land under Israeli control, contrary to this notion of 1967 borders, there's no such thing as 1967 borders. It was an armistice line. It was a ceasefire line. And Israel was supposed to, going back to 1949, Israel was supposed to return to the partition or some other mutually agreed place. But it simply refused to do that, as it has refused to do everything it was supposed to do since. There is no 1967 borders. Even if we said that there were, it is not possible to make a viable Palestinian state out of what's left. And there's no way to do justice to the refugees in that context. So I think the main thing will be to start to broach the subject of the legitimacy of the state itself.
Thank you, Tom. I can see from all my little images that a lot of people are clapping and smiling at the comments you just made there. I would say that from a general perspective, it's very, very hard for anybody to challenge the state of Israel's right to exist. But I think it's right to challenge it. It's right to exist in its current format. And what Thomas just said there, I think it gives me some hope about how I might be able to talk about that to those that I come into contact with. I want to say thank you to our three speakers. I believe we could sit here for at least the rest of the day, or if you're there, or the night for those who are this evening, because there is so much to unpack and share. I'm overawed by what you said. I bless all three of you. Thank you so much for sharing what you've done tonight. And thank you to everybody who's been kind enough to put comments in the chat box. I've taken copies of those comments and we will share them with the Sabeel team and try to find a way, not only of putting the recording, but putting some of the comments out there as well, so that you can all see how people were feeling. Two things I need to just highlight. One is that our next webinar, which is on the 27th of March, the same time, we have another three amazing speakers. You'll see some posters come out with all the details, but that's on Islam and Islamophobia, following through the theme of religious extremism. And then in April, we'll have one on Christophobia, which may be a word that many people are not necessarily aware of, but it's kind of one that's developed out of our program of religious extremism. And also to highlight again that our conference in November is the 17th to the 21st. And what we're trying to do is to get as many people to come to Palestine as possible. Please, if you're able to come. We don't have a huge amount of resources, but if there's somebody specifically needs a little bit of support financially, we might be able to do that. But most importantly, we need to demonstrate by physical presence our support of Palestine and Palestinians, and our support of the Jewish community who are working with us for peace. Sabeel is an organization based on Palestinian liberation, but as we've all heard our speakers say, liberation will only come if both sides learn to live together in some format. And so please pray as much as you can, and please share the thoughts of our speakers tonight with those you talk to, and maybe, just maybe, bit by bit, what we hope will happen may one day happen, God willing. I think one of the most important things I've heard recently was Munter Isaac's sermon where God is in the rubble. Broke my heart, and I'm sure it broke many people's heart, because it's true. So thank you everybody tonight. My God's blessing on all of you, and we hope to see you on the 27th of March, and we will share the YouTube link to this very shortly. Thank you.
Thank you.